They set me up with a divorced mom as a prank. My reaction left the entire table silent. She walked in at exactly 7:41, and the table went quiet in a way I recognized immediately. Not the polite pause that happens when someone new arrives and the conversation reorganizes itself around them. This was a specific quiet, the held breath kind, the kind that lives in the gap between a punchline being set up and the moment it lands. I had been sitting with these people for 11 minutes. I had already clocked Derek's grin when I pulled out my chair. I had already understood, from the specific texture of that grin, that something was wrong. I just hadn't known yet what the wrong thing was. She was wearing a dark jacket over a simple blouse, and she moved across the restaurant the way people move when they've learned, through some process that was probably not gentle, to take up exactly as much space as they need, and not 1 inch more. She scanned the table once. She found my face. She held my gaze for a moment, and then she sat down. She did not look embarrassed. That was the first thing I noticed, that she did not look embarrassed. And I noticed it because everyone around her was quietly waiting for her to be. "You must be the one they didn't tell anything real about," she said. I said, "Probably, yes." To my left, someone exhaled a laugh into their glass. The table had the barely suppressed energy of an audience watching a stage, and I was apparently one of the performers, and I had not been given a script. Her name was Claire. She picked up the menu and began reading it with the focused attention of someone who had decided to have dinner regardless of whatever else might be happening around that dinner. She asked the waiter, when he came, whether the risotto used a vegetable or chicken stock. Not nervously, conversationally, the question of someone who was not rattled. I thought, this is not what they expected to happen. To be clear about what was happening, my friends, and I use the word generously, had set up a blind date as a joke. The logic, as I would understand it later, was this. I had been single for 2 years. I had been, in their estimation, too selective, and the funniest possible correction to that problem was to set me up with someone they assumed I would find unsuitable. A divorced woman. A mother. Someone they expected me to look at across a table and visibly deflate, and then the joke would be the deflating, and we would all laugh about it afterward at the bar. I want to slow down here and be honest about who I was before that dinner, because the joke requires me to explain its intended audience. I was 34, and I wrote for a living, and I had, in the 2 years since my last relationship ended, become the kind of person my friends described as particular, which was a polite word for something else. I had turned down setups before, not because I thought I was too good for anyone, but because I had learned the slow and expensive way that I was bad at pretending interest I didn't feel, and worse at the specific social suffering of a dinner with someone who had been described incorrectly. So I had stopped accepting setups. My friends had decided to correct this by engineering one I couldn't refuse. Derek had organized it. He'd told me I was meeting someone impressive. He'd used that word specifically, impressive. He knew me well enough to know that impressive was the right lever to pull. He'd told Claire something similar, with adjustments I would learn about later. He'd booked the reservation for 7:30 so that he and Kyle's companion, Maya, a woman I'd met twice at group events and found pleasant but forgettable, would all be seated and in position when Claire walked in, and when I arrived 3 minutes after her. The staging required everyone to be early. Derek had told them separately to arrive at 7:15. That is how much coordination had gone into making this evening happen. Someone had set a calendar reminder to arrive 15 minutes early in order to be seated and ready to watch 2 people be embarrassed. I want to be specific about what the joke was supposed to be, because I want to be specific about what it tells you about the people who were laughing. The joke was that she was supposed to be less than. Not less than me, that's too simple and not quite right. Less than the life a man like me, in the estimation of the people at that table, should be aiming for. A divorced woman meant a failed marriage. A mother meant complication. Both together meant, in the shorthand of a certain kind of social arithmetic, that she was a consolation prize, and the comedy was the gap between what I deserved and what had been arranged. The laugh was supposed to come from my face, from watching me understand what I'd been handed. She read the menu. She asked about the risotto. She did not perform embarrassment for anyone. And I thought, I would like to know this person. The rest of this table I already know well enough. The first 20 minutes were a performance I was not participating in. The table had the rhythm of people who were in on something, who occasionally glanced at each other with a particular look of people storing material to discuss later. Two people to Derek's right, Kyle and a woman whose name I still don't fully have, Maya or Maria, were doing it most openly. Derek himself was more measured about it, which I noted. He was watching, but not grinning anymore. He was watching the way someone watches when they have an investment in the outcome and want to read it accurately. Claire was not performing unawareness. She was simply choosing not to perform awareness of other people's performances, which is a different and more dignified thing. We talked about the food. We talked about the neighborhood. She knew it better than I did. Had been coming to this specific block since before the restaurant existed, when the space had been a dry cleaner's. She had a daughter, she said, when it came up naturally rather than nervously, the way you'd mention any fact about your life. 7 years old. Named for a grandmother. That's a beautiful name, I said. She's a better person than I was at 7, Claire said. Which is either good parenting or good genetics, and I genuinely can't tell which. I laughed, the real kind. Kyle glanced at Derek. You right, she said a little later. Not a question. How do you know that? I looked you up. She said it completely without apology, picking up her wine glass. When someone texts me a stranger's name and tells me to show up for dinner, I look them up. It's a safety practice. A pause. You write about people who didn't intend to be interesting. That's the most accurate description anyone has given me, I said. I read 2 of them on the drive over. She set the glass down. The one about the woman who kept her ex-husband's last name after the divorce, because she'd built her professional reputation under it and didn't want to start over. And the one about the man who quit his job without telling anyone and spent 3 weeks pretending to still go to work. Those are 2 of my better ones, I said. The woman with the last name was better, she said. The man pretending to go to work you felt sorry for in a way that was slightly too visible. You should trust the reader more. The table had stopped pretending not to listen. I looked at her across the risotto and the bread basket and the particular flickering of the candle between us. And I thought, she is going to be the most interesting person at this table for the rest of the evening, and that is going to deeply inconvenience several people who expected something different. The external events of the next 45 minutes were small, but they accumulated in the way small things do when you're paying close attention to all of them simultaneously. Derek checked his phone under the table twice in the first hour, which was not unusual for Derek. Derek existed in a state of perpetual low-grade device management, but which I found myself tracking anyway, noting the timing. Noting each time his eyes went not to the general table, but to a specific point across it. Kyle refilled his own glass more than he refilled anyone else's, which meant he was either thirsty or slightly uncomfortable, and the discomfort read as the particular kind that comes when a joke is not landing in the direction that was intended. Maya had gone quiet in a way that was different from her usual quietness, not comfortable, but watchful. The expression of someone who is recalibrating in real time. I had spent enough time studying the textures of human social discomfort to recognize it when I was sitting across from it. The waiter came and went. The bread basket was replaced. Someone ordered another bottle of the red without asking the table, which is what people do when they need the social lubricant of a task. And through all of it, Claire held her half of our conversation with the focused attention of someone who had decided that this dinner was happening, and she was going to have it, regardless of what the surrounding circumstances were doing. That, I would come to understand, was not a small thing. That was a choice she was making continuously, every few minutes, against something that was pulling in the other direction. And Claire and I talked. She was a structural engineer who had recently started her own consulting practice after leaving a firm where she had been, for 4 years, the person who fixed the calculations on projects she was not credited for. "You do good work under someone else's name for long enough," she said, "and one day you realize you've been building their reputation with your hands." She had left. She had started over. She had a daughter in 2nd grade and a practice that was, in her words, 18 months old and still sometimes terrifying and mostly hers. She said it the way you say things that cost something to say, steadily, with no performance of either pride or grief. Just the flat accuracy of someone reporting what happened and then looking at you to see if you understand the report. "Was leaving difficult?" I said. "Everything worth doing is difficult," she said. "The difficulty isn't the point. The question is whether the thing on the other side of the difficult is worth it." She looked at her glass. "I've answered that question twice in the last 3 years. Both times the answer was yes, and both times I was genuinely not sure it would be." I thought about what she wasn't saying and what that cost to the firm you left. I said, "Did they know what you'd been contributing?" "They knew," she said. "Knowledge and acknowledgement are different things. They knew in the way institutions know things they've decided not to formalize, because formalizing would require either crediting you properly or admitting they hadn't been." She broke off a piece of bread. "I had a conversation with my direct supervisor in my 3rd year. I brought a specific project, a load-bearing calculation they'd gotten wrong on a $4 million renovation, which I found and corrected before it went to the contractor. I brought the original calculation and my correction and the communication chain showing the timeline, and my supervisor said, and I want to be exact about his phrasing, 'This kind of attention to detail is exactly why you're such a valuable member of our team.'" She looked at me. Not, "Your name is going on this project." Not, "We should discuss your title." "Team member." He handed the bread back, in different phrasing. "What did you say?" I said, "Thank you." She paused. I said, "Thank you," and then I went home and spent 3 months figuring out how to leave, and then I left. She picked up her wine, which is the boring version of a story that felt enormous while I was living it. Derek laughed at something Kyle said, 2 seats down. The sound was too loud for the joke's apparent size. "It's not boring," I said. "It's also not unusual," she said, which is the more depressing point. She looked at me with the evaluating look I was beginning to recognize, the one that sat her reading behind it. "Do you write about that kind of thing? The institutional kind of smallness, not the dramatic kind?" "Sometimes," I said. "The institutional kind is harder to dramatize. The dramatic kind gives you a single scene. The institutional kind gives you 100 almost scenes, none of which are good enough on their own, but all of which together are the story." "Yes," she said, with the precision of someone who had just heard their experience named in a way it hadn't been before. "Exactly that." I thought about 100 almost scenes adding up. I thought about 3 years and a load-bearing calculation and a supervisor who said team member. I thought, she is the most interesting person at this table, and possibly in this restaurant, and the people who organized this evening as a joke have made a significant miscalculation. I thought about what she wasn't saying, and the weight that was carrying, too. Her phone lit up on the table beside her plate. She glanced at it. Just a glance, a second, maybe two. But I watched something move through her expression, quickly, before she set the phone face down and picked up her fork again. "Sorry," she said. "Carry on." "You don't have to apologize," I said. "No," she said. And then, "But I might need to step outside for just a moment in a few minutes, if that's all right." It was, I told her. Of course it was. She was gone for 7 minutes. I counted without meaning to. The table, freed from the social contract of her presence, shifted. Derek said something to Kyle in a low voice. Kyle's companion, Maya or Maria, said, "Is she coming back?" with the tone of someone who was unsure whether to be disappointed or relieved. I said yes. She came back. She sat down. She had the look of someone who had pressed down carefully on something and was monitoring whether it was going to stay pressed. "Everything all right?" I said. "It will be," she said. That was my lawyer. She reached for her wine glass and held it without drinking. "My lawyer calls me after 7 on a Friday when something is happening that she thinks I should know about before the weekend." "And something is happening?" She looked at me directly, in the way that happens sometimes when two people have been talking for an hour and the filters have come down enough that the thing being said is the actual thing. "My ex-husband," she said, "filed a motion this morning requesting an emergency custody review. The hearing is scheduled for Monday." She looked at her glass. "The basis of the motion, as of this morning, is that I demonstrate poor judgment in my personal life during periods when I have custody of our daughter." The table was not listening to this conversation. They were having their own, deliberately, in the way people do when they're pretending not to eavesdrop. "Poor judgment, meaning what? Specifically?" I said. "Meaning," she said, "going on dates when my daughter is home, with a sitter." I looked at the table around us, the reservation, the setup, the dinner, organized by Derek, on a night when I had been told to arrive at 7:30 and Claire had been told something similar, and both of us had shown up to a table full of people who had been there first and were now performing a performance they thought we weren't tracking. "Claire," I said, "how did you find out about the prank?" She set her glass down. "Someone texted me," she said, "about an hour before I left to come here. An anonymous number, which means it was probably someone who didn't want to get in trouble, but also didn't want me walking into it blind." She paused. "They told me what tonight was supposed to be. That I was the joke." She looked at me, and I came anyway. Why? What she said next was so quiet I almost missed it under the table noise and the sound of the restaurant doing its evening work around us. "Because," she said, "I spent 3 years being made small. I decided tonight I was done rehearsing it." I sat with that for a moment. I spent 3 years being made small. I decided tonight I was done rehearsing it. There are sentences that take the shape of the person who says them, that tell you something true about the interior of someone that no amount of conversation would have found as efficiently. And that one, the specific economy of it, the way she had arrived at that phrasing, the steadiness of her voice when she delivered it, told me that she had spent a long time sitting with both halves of it, the 3 years, and the decision, and that the decision was not recent and not easy, but was real, which is why she had walked into a restaurant she knew was set up against her and asked about the stock in the risotto. She had come because she had decided. The person who had organized this dinner. The motion filed this morning on the basis of her personal life. The specific Friday night chosen for a setup that would put her at a restaurant table, on record, on a date, while her daughter was home with a sitter. Things that had seemed unrelated were arranging themselves. "How long have you and your ex been in contested custody proceedings?" I said. 8 months. Her voice was careful now, choosing each word. He has a very good attorney, and he has people who tell him things. About my life. About where I go and who I see. She stopped. People who have been close enough to know. I thought about the specific configuration of this evening. The table. Who had organized it? Who was at it? Who had chosen the date and the time, and had been, for the past hour, checking his phone under the table with the diligence of someone managing something that required monitoring. I looked at Derek. Derek was talking to Kyle, glass in hand, relaxed in the posture of someone who believed the evening was proceeding as planned. His phone was on the table now, screen down, beside his water glass. As I looked, it lit up. Just for a second, just long enough to show, at the top of the notification preview, a name. Ethan, her ex-husband's name, I would learn later, was Ethan. I looked at the phone. I looked at Derek. I looked at Claire, who was looking at her plate. I thought about a woman who had come to a dinner that was designed to humiliate her because she was tired of being the kind of person who stayed home from things that were designed to humiliate her. I thought about a 7-year-old at home with a sitter, unaware that her Friday night was being used as evidence in a legal proceeding her father's friend was helping to build. I thought about 8 months of contested proceedings and a motion filed that morning and an attorney on speed dial who calls after 7 on a Friday when something has happened. I thought about what it means to organize a dinner. Derek's phone lit up again. There are moments where you understand something completely and choose what to do about it in the same second, and this was one of those. I picked up my own phone. I opened the camera. I set it on the table facing Derek's phone at an angle that was unhurried and unremarkable, and I waited for the screen to light up again. It lit up. The preview was visible for 3 seconds. Enough, the photograph existed now. I set my phone down. I looked at Derek. "Derek," I said. Not loudly. The table continued its conversation for one more beat. And then it didn't, because something in the way I said his name registered as a different register of speech than everything that had come before it. He looked at me. "Tell me something," I said. "What's Ethan's last name?" The table went completely quiet. Not the held breath quiet from when Claire walked in. Something stiller than that, the kind of quiet that arrives when something has been named that everyone present understood they were not supposed to know was there. Derek's face went through 3 expressions in about 2 seconds. The first was confusion. Performed? The second was the expression underneath the performed confusion, which was not confusion at all. The third was the expression of someone who has been seen. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "That's fine," I said. I kept my voice even. This was important, not raised, not theatrical, just level and certain, the way you speak, when you know what you know. "Your phone has been on the table for the last 20 minutes. When it lights up, the preview shows the recipient name. I picked up my own phone. I took a photograph when it lit up just now. You're welcome to tell me I'm wrong about the name I saw." The table was a held breath. Derek said nothing. I looked at Claire. She was looking at Derek with an expression that was not surprise. "Do you want to leave?" I said. She looked at me. "Yes," she said. We stood up at the same time. She picked up her jacket from the back of her chair and I dropped enough on the table to cover our 2 orders, not Derek's, and then I said, to the table, to no one specific, to everyone, This wasn't a prank on me. Just that. 7 words, said quietly, and then I looked at Derek one final time. Your phone exists, and so does my photograph, and so does Claire's lawyer's phone number, which she will be receiving both of those things tonight. We walked out. The door closed behind us, and the air outside was cooler than the restaurant, and the street was doing its ordinary Friday evening work. People moving past with ordinary Friday evening intentions, none of whom knew or cared what had just happened at a table inside. Claire stopped on the sidewalk and stood for a moment with her hands in her jacket pockets, and her face turned slightly up, the way people stand when they're breathing after something. That was... She started. I know, I said. You didn't have to. Claire, I said. He was live texting your evening to the man building a case to take your daughter. She was quiet. The photograph goes to your lawyer tonight, I said. Not because it's dramatic. Because it documents that this dinner was organized by a person with a direct interest in your custody proceedings, which means tonight wasn't you exercising poor judgment in your personal life. Tonight was you being set up by a documented associate of your ex-husband on a Friday that was probably not a coincidence. I paused. That's a different legal story than the one his attorney filed this morning. She looked at me for a long moment in the particular way that people look at someone when they're deciding how much to trust what they're seeing. I understood the impulse. She had arrived at this evening knowing it was designed to use her, and she had come anyway because she was done rehearsing smallness, and now a stranger was standing on a sidewalk telling her he had done something to help her, and that is exactly the kind of sentence that experience teaches you to examine carefully. Why did you do that? She said. I thought about the honest answer, which was layered. Because what Derek had done was a specifically ugly thing, and I had a photograph and a clear conscience, and I am not the kind of person who sits at a table watching something wrong happen if I can do something about it. But also, if I am being fully honest with myself on a sidewalk in the cooling air of a Friday night. Because she had come to this dinner knowing what it was, and had sat down and asked about the stock in the risotto, and told me my second best story was the better one, and offered literary criticism without being asked, and I had been paying close enough attention to notice that she was the most real person at a table full of people performing. Because you came anyway, I said, when you didn't have to. When the whole point was for you not to. She looked at me. The evening traffic moved. Someone walked past with a dog who wanted to examine my shoes. My lawyer is going to want to understand exactly what you saw, she said. I'll tell her whatever she needs. And the photograph, I'll send it right now. She took out her phone and sent me her lawyer's contact. I sent the photograph within 2 minutes, with a note explaining the context. The lawyer responded at 9:47 p.m. I know because Claire showed me the timestamp later, confirming receipt and noting that the documentation of the setup potentially reframed the entire basis of the emergency motion. We walked for a while after that. Not purposefully, not toward anything specific. The way you walk when the urgent thing is done, and you find yourself in the sudden, unconstrained space of a Friday evening that has been freed from the shape it was supposed to have. The street outside the restaurant was a Friday street, purposeful foot traffic. The particular energy of people heading toward things rather than away from them. We moved with it without deciding to, past a coffee shop already closing, past a bookstore with its lights still on and one person visible inside at the counter. She stopped briefly at the window the way people stop at bookstore windows, scanning spines. "Do you have anything in there?" she said. "One collection," I said. "Usually in the back left, which is where they put things that are good, but not currently front of store. Back left is where I'd look anyway," she said. And she smiled, and it was different from the composed, measured expressions she'd held at the restaurant table. It was quicker and less guarded, the kind that arrives when the performance is over and something real has been given permission to show up. We kept walking. She told me more about her practice, a hospital renovation project she'd just won the bid on, which was the largest contract she'd taken on alone, and which she was, she said, equal parts prepared for and terrified by. I told her more about the stories, about what it was like to build a living out of other people's almost moments, the things they let you write down, and the things they asked you not to. At some point she mentioned her daughter again, the full name, the grandmother's name, and said she had a habit of falling asleep during movies starting from minute 47, which was a source of ongoing affectionate tension between them. She said it the way people say things about being loved specifically by a specific person, with the unself-conscious ease of someone who has gotten to stop being careful about it. She sounds wonderful, I said. She is the best person I know, Claire said without hesitation or sentimentality, just as a fact she had verified repeatedly. She is also 7, which means she is occasionally a complete menace, but those things coexist. She paused. She asked me this morning where I was going tonight. I said dinner with someone interesting. She said, "How do you know if they're interesting before you go?" And I said, "You don't. That's the point of going." Claire looked at me, which I then had to believe in under slightly unusual circumstances. "You did," I said. "Believe in it." "I did," she said, somewhat to my own surprise. The bookstore was behind us now, and the street was quieter, and she was walking slightly closer than she'd been outside the restaurant, the natural narrowing of a sidewalk that accommodated it without either of us deciding. I walked her to her car. She had parked 3 blocks from the restaurant, she said, because parallel parking remained one of the few skills she had never fully made peace with, which she offered as a piece of information with the same even tone she used for everything else. "Your second story was still the better one," she said at the car. "I'll tell my editor. The one about the man pretending to go to work, you were too gentle with him. You let him off in the ending in a way that felt like you liked him more than the story required." "I did like him," I said. "I still think he deserved the gentleness." She considered this. "Maybe," she said, "but the reader needs to earn the gentleness with you. You gave it too early." She looked at me steadily. The woman with the last name knew exactly what she was doing and why, and you let her be exactly that complicated, and it was better. Write more women like that. I will think about that note for a long time. It was the most useful piece of writing feedback I'd received in 2 years, delivered outside a restaurant at 10:15 on a Friday night by a person I'd met 3 hours earlier. "Also," she said, and then paused, looking at the key in her hand, a pause that had a different quality than the others, not searching for the word but deciding whether to say it. "Thank you for what you did in there. And for," she seemed to settle, "for seeing what was happening." "You saw it too," I said. "You saw it before I did." "I saw it," she said. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know if I was allowed to do anything with it. There's a thing that happens when you've been inside a bad situation for a long time, where you stop trusting your own read on what's happening. You second-guess whether what you're seeing is real, or whether you're the problem. She looked at her key. "I've been second-guessing for a while." "You weren't the problem," I said. She looked at me. Something that had been held carefully behind her eyes for most of the evening moved, briefly, and then settled back into composure. "No," she said. "I know that. I just needed someone else to see it too." She unlocked the car. "Then," she said, with her hand on the door, "I make very good coffee. My daughter has informed me it's the best coffee she's ever had. though she has had exactly 4 samples in her lifetime, including mine. That's still a statistically meaningful endorsement, I said. Saturday morning, she said. If you're not doing anything. I was not doing anything. Saturday morning, I said. She drove away. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching the taillights find the traffic, and then I began walking back the long way, the way that takes you past the park instead of through the side street. Because it was a good night for the long way, and I had something to think about, and the long way is the right route for that. The emergency custody motion was withdrawn 11 days later. Claire's lawyer filed a counter-motion documenting that the Friday dinner had been organized by a man with an ongoing documented relationship with the opposing party, and that the motion's factual basis, Claire's dating behavior during custody time, rested on a situation that had been deliberately manufactured and monitored in real time. The judge did not find this incidental. Derek's involvement and the photograph of his phone screen and the text log her lawyer subsequently subpoenaed told a story that was significantly more useful to Claire than to her ex-husband. The legal details beyond that are Claire's, not mine, and they continue in the way these things do, slowly through the institutions designed for them, which are imperfect, but which are, it turns out, capable of recognizing when evidence has been constructed rather than discovered. I will say only that Ethan's attorney filed no further emergency motions. What I know is that she kept custody of her daughter. What I know is that a 7-year-old with a grandmother's name still falls asleep at minute 47 of every movie, which means her mother keeps selecting films that are 46 minutes or shorter, which is, it turns out, a surprisingly rich category. What I know is that the coffee was, in fact, excellent, and that the endorsement was accurate, and that I drank it on a Saturday morning in an apartment that had a corkboard with a structural drawing pinned to it that she was already revising when I arrived. And what I know about that Friday night, the part that stays with me, that I come back to when I think about the way people decide who they're going to be in a specific moment, is not what I did with the photograph, or what the lawyer said, or the motion withdrawn. It is not the confrontation at the table, or the walk, or even the coffee on Saturday morning. It's something smaller and earlier than all of that. It's that she walked into a restaurant knowing exactly what it was built to do to her, with 1 hour's notice, and no obligation, and every reasonable justification in the world to simply not show up. And she sat down anyway. And she asked about the stock and the risotto, and she told me my second story was the better one. And she was right. I spent 3 years being made small, she had said. I decided tonight I was done rehearsing it. That is the kind of sentence you say when you have already become someone they didn't plan for. She was never supposed to be the punchline. She was never supposed to be anything other than exactly what she walked in as. And the remarkable thing, the thing the people at that table had completely miscalculated, is that she already knew it. Have you ever watched someone walk into a room that was designed to diminish them and take their seat anyway, and felt something change in you because of it? Have you ever said yes to something that looked small from the outside? A walk, a coffee, a Friday evening you could have easily skipped, and looked back on it later as one of the things that quietly became everything? Tell me about it in the comments. And if you want more stories about the moments that announce themselves as jokes and turn out to be something else entirely, subscribe. I'll be here.